But anyways...
Sorry, I don't understand.
Me neither, Ghoul. Hey guys, so Secrets of Dumbledore is finally out, and we can finally break this movie down and really look at it. So I'm going to go really in depth in this video and do a complete, full, deep dive review of this entire movie, giving you all my ideas on all my thoughts for how I felt this movie affected the Fantastic Beasts series, how it changed the Harry Potter world, and everything to do with it. So I'm going to start off with a quick spoiler-free review about what I thought about the movie itself, the direction, the actors, all that stuff. And then I'll give you guys plenty of warning for the spoiler part where I'm going to go into every single detail of this movie that I think is relevant and really, really tear it apart. So without further ado, here we go. So, Secrets of Dumbledore. We're finally at Fantastic Beasts. We're at the third movie, and here we go. So, we've jumped ahead a little bit in this movie, and this movie starts off in 1932, which honestly I had to look up because they don't really say this in the movie, which means that it's been 5 years since the last time we've seen these characters because Crimes of Grindelwald took place in 1927. And this movie has more of a Mission Impossible kind of James Bond feel to it, where basically, without giving any spoilers away for the movie, so the main characters are banding together and they're basically trying to undermine Grindelwald as there's an upcoming International Confederation of Wizards election coming up, and Grindelwald is probably up to something involving this election. And so we meet our team very early on, which is introduced to us in the trailer, and the team is comprised of Eulalie Hicks, aka Lolly, Jacob Kowalski, Theseus Scamander, Newt Scamander, Bunty Broadacre, I think this is the first time we find out her last name, and Yusuf Kama. And so, broad strokes, it's a pretty good plot for a middle-of-the-road movie. I really do try to compare this movie to something like Order of the Phoenix in the original Harry Potter series, because this is kind of where this movie is. It's more like a setup movie. It kind of wants to establish things going forwards, and there's going to be some effort to just make sure that everything is set up for the next stage. And this is not necessarily like the last movie or the second last movie in the installment, in which case much more eventful things are going to be happening. Obviously, in the next movie and probably the last movie, we're going to see the actual Wizarding War, and that's going to be much more violent and spectacular, much more character deaths, and that's probably going to be happening in the future, but we're still more focusing on building up the world right now and building up the stakes of Grindelwald's rise to power. And this movie basically holds up to the standard that we've come to expect from the Fantastic Beasts series. Eddie Redmayne once again does a great job as being Newt Scamander, extremely captivating, and he does all the weird things he's supposed to do very well. I still love Dan Fogler as Jacob Kowalski. He might be my favorite character. Jude Law is still doing a great Albus Dumbledore, and we get a couple new characters in this movie who I think do really good characters as well. Of those, easily Richard Coyle, who plays Aberforth Dumbledore, and I really love Aberforth. I liked his character in the books, I liked him in Deathly Hallows, the movies, and I like him now. And Mads Mikkelsen comes in, taking over for Johnny Depp as the new Gellert Grindelwald, and I think he does a pretty good job as well. In fact, I think in Crimes of Grindelwald, Johnny Depp's version of Gellert Grindelwald was a little over the top. It's a little too Captain Jack Sparrow for me, and then Gellert Grindelwald, as he's portrayed in this movie, is just a little bit more grounded, and I kind of believe him more, as opposed to kind of the more wacky energy that Johnny Depp brought to the character. And for the rest of the movie, everything is pretty much up to par with what we've expected from the Fantastic Beasts series. The CGI looks great, everything looks realistic. David Yates is back directing, and that's pretty good. The soundtrack also sounds good. Overall, I'd have to say, as a movie, there's not that much to complain about. But now, putting aside all the technical aspects that go into movie making, we have the biggest part that I like to talk about, which is plot. And the only thing I can really say in the spoiler-free section about the plot is that the pacing did feel a little slow, and that's kind of just a side effect of this movie being about a political campaign and a rise to power instead of some sort of event where life and death are in the balance. Any time where the stakes are politics, it just feels a little Star Wars The Phantom Menace for me, and it kind of brings down the energy level of the climax. So I don't think this movie has like a huge crescendo the way the Deathly Hallows movies had it, for example, or even the first Fantastic Beasts movie, because lives were just on the line there. But that's literally all I can say in the spoiler-free section. So if you haven't seen this movie yet, what I'm basically going to tell you is that if you enjoyed Crimes of Grindelwald, I think this is actually a step up from that, and you'll probably really enjoy this movie. And if you're just a Harry Potter fan and a fan of the universe in general, I think you'll actually have a pretty good time with this movie. But with that being said, it's time for me to really get down and smashing up this plot, and now we're just going to break it down. So guys, if you haven't seen this movie, please bookmark this video, come back, go watch the movie. And now I'm going to go into the spoiler section. We're going to breaking down every part of this movie and really talk about in depth about the entire plot of this movie from start to end. Now, for the sake of this video not being a full hour long with me talking about every minute detail, I'm actually going to keep a lot of the plot holes or inaccuracies that I found in this movie. I'm going to put those aside for now, and I'm going to be talking about those in a later video. And so if you're watching this, you think, oh, he's not noticing this, or he's not talking about this feature that I missed. I probably did notice it, I just don't think it's specifically relevant to the plot and the review of this movie. And so I'm going to save it for later and really break it down there. So the movie starts off with Dumbledore and Grindelwald talking about basically what happened in the last movie. We reestablish that Dumbledore has the Blood Pact, and that he seeks to destroy it so that he can act against Grindelwald. So we then jump forward to Newt, who's present for the birth of a mystical Chinese East Asian deer horse creature called a Qilin. And this Qilin is the major MacGuffin for the entire movie. Soon after the birth of this Qilin, Credence and Rosier and a couple of Grindelwald's goons show up, and they kill the mother and try to steal the calf, which they successfully do, and nearly kill Newt in the process, but he manages to survive. He then finds out that the Qilin mother actually had another baby, and that's going to be the key part of this entire movie. Now, I like how this is given to us here, because later on, after we see the movie and we go back, we can deconstruct Dumbledore's entire plan, because the fact that he knew that there was an upcoming election, and he knew that this Qilin was stolen by Grindelwald, he can pretty easily put together what Grindelwald's plan is just from these two things. But to keep rolling forward, the next thing we see is Theseus and Newt back in the Hogshead with Dumbledore, and Dumbledore finally gives us some answers as to what this blood pact is. So Theseus refers to it as a blood troth, which seems like a weird renaming of it. Maybe someone decided that troth sounded cooler than pact. But basically, Dumbledore explains how it works a little bit in the sense that he says that if any thought of betraying Grindelwald crosses his heart, the Blood Pact will try to kill him, among other possibly worse things. He then goes on to being extremely vague about how it was made, referring to it as young man's magic, and even more vaguely says that it probably cannot even be undone, which is definitely something I'm going to come back to at the end of this review. So then we jump back to Manhattan, where we see a new character who was kind of introduced in Crimes of Grindelwald in passing, Eulalie, aka Lolly Hicks, who goes out of her way to recruit Jacob in order to go back on the team. So Lolly stages an attack on her to encourage Jacob to intervene, to prove to Jacob that he is a hero and really is needed to help with this conflict, which is possibly the first part of this movie that feels a little off, because at the end of the day, Jacob is just a muggle, and how much really is he going to help in this conflict? But my bigger issue with this scene is that we find out that the three goons who are attacking Lolly are actually friends of her, and this entire attack is planned. Which really makes me wonder why Lolly knocks out one of her friends. She casts a full body bind charm on him, and while those aren't painful in themselves, the guy does fall from his feet backwards onto the floor without having his hands to break his fall. Come on, Lolly, do you not care about him? That's gonna hurt your back. Anyways, Lolly successfully recruits Jacob, and she uses a magic book portkey that we've never seen before in order to bring Jacob and herself onto the train and convene with all the rest of the team that's going to be important on taking down Grindelwald. And so we get onto the train, which is shown in the trailers, and we finally meet the 6 members of this team that is going to be critical for the rest of this movie. There's Lolly Hicks, the Ilvermorny professor who recruited Jacob, Jacob himself, Yusuf Kami, Bunty Broadacre, Newt Scamander, and his brother Theseus. And in a moment that kind of brings you back to the will of Albus Dumbledore in Deathly Hallows, When Dumbledore leaves a bunch of enigmatic items to Ron, Hermione, and Harry in order for them to take on Voldemort, Dumbledore gives out a couple magical items to Lolly, Theseus, and Jacob, as well as a super secret self-destructing message, as I said, very Mission Impossible, that he gives to Bunty so that she knows what she has to do. And so Dumbledore, via Newt, hands Theseus a tie, which we'll find out how that's useful later. He gave Lolly the Porky book that we've seen already, and gives Jacob a very nice looking stick, which I kind of feel was designed more for misdirecting the audience in the trailer than any actual reason so far in this movie, because at the end of the day, this is just a really fancy looking stick. And you gotta kind of love Jacob's character even more for the fact that he's so happy to get this, even though it's basically just a twig, and as far as we know, doesn't have any magic associated with it. But at the end of the day, Jacob here is kind of like Charlie Brown on Halloween.
I got it wrong.
They also try to establish here what seems like the makings of a new love triangle between Theseus, Newt, and Lolly, as Newt seems a little uncomfortable and a little romantic tension between him and this new Ilvermorny professor, and seems a little reluctant to introduce her to his older brother, which I feel like is totally unnecessary because we already had a love triangle between those two and Leta Lestrange in the last movie, and it feels a little ridiculous to instantly create a new character just to re-establish a new love triangle here. But whatever, it's not a huge part of the movie, so I'm not going to dwell on it. They finally, in this train scene, confirm something that we've basically known since Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, which is that Grindelwald is a seer. And so in order to defeat him, they're going to implement something known as countersight, a completely new term in the Harry Potter universe, basically involving being so complicated and subversive that you can undermine someone's ability to predict the future by the way you act. This kind of actually throws back to Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them when they're trying to capture Dougal the Demiguise, whose sight is actually based off his ability to predict the future. So in order to capture him, you have to act extremely unpredictable. It's definitely a fun idea, and I'm here for the ride at this point, but it definitely does seem like a very strange screenwriting concept to basically say that the plot from here on is going to get a little confusing and a little random. So with the team finally together, they arrive in Berlin, and most of the team sets off to the German Ministry of Magic, where they intend on delivering a message to Anton Vogel, who is both the German Minister for Magic at the time, and more importantly, the Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederations of Wizards. Now, I don't fully know, but I do not think they refer to the leader of the International Confederations of Wizards in this entire movie as the Supreme Mugwump, but it's so entrenched in my brains from knowing the books that I kind of just assume that that's what they said. But I actually think they avoided using the word Mugwump for pretty much the entire movie. Anyways, Newt, Theseus, Jacob, and Lolly go talk to Anton Vogel and go to a meeting of the International Confederation of Wizards, where there's a huge surprise twist, and Anton Vogel exonerates and expunges the criminal record of one Gellert Grindelwald, which I think is excessive confirmation at this point that Anton Vogel is definitely in cahoots with him, but for some reason none of the major characters seem to figure that out until much later on in this movie. And not only does Anton Vogel exonerate Grindelwald for all his past crimes, but he also allows him to run for a position as the Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, an election which is going to happen in 2 days. So obviously the main characters here are kind of unhappy with this. Jacob kind of throws a fit, and Theseus seems to forget that he is in Germany and not in Britain, and his authority as the leader of the Aura Office of the UK does not extend into foreign countries, which results in him trying to arrest some of Grindelwald's supporters inside the Ministry of Magic in Germany, and the German Aurors take him into custody. By the way, it's completely clear at this point that the German ministry has completely fallen and Grindelwald is basically puppeting the entire country, but that's still not going to be fully confirmed until a little bit later. Either way, while these 4 characters were off at the Ministry of Magic, Eustace Kama actually went to join up with Gellert Grindelwald as a spy, which does seem like a classic Dumbledore move to try to insert a spy within the camp of the enemy, but we'll talk about how this plays out later. At the same time, Bunty goes to find a specialist who can replicate Newt Scamander's case so they can make a bunch of extra cases that they're going to need in the 3rd act of this movie. Now, why Bunty needed to go to Germany to replicate Newt's case, especially when they only needed something to look like it from the outside, along with the fact that why they bothered bringing the Qilin to Germany when they're trying to protect it until it goes to Bhutan, and why they need to hire a specialist to duplicate this case at all. I mean, it seems like Dumbledore has forgotten the Gemino spell that we've known about since Deathly Hallows, and he'll actually kind of use later on in this movie, but I'm getting carried away with myself. So Dumbledore's in the Hogshead, and he finds out from Minerva McGonagall that Theseus has been arrested in Germany. So he decides to jump on over to the German Ministry of Magic to talk to the main characters there about how to help Theseus and what to do next. This then leads to him encountering Credence in the streets of Berlin, where he basically spits on his reflection in order to transport him and Credence into the mirror dimension from Doctor Strange, which talk about a lot of new magic that is introduced for one scene that basically plays no part of the rest of this movie. Anyways, in this kind of alternate dimension, he fights Credence and basically defeats him without almost any effort, being able to subdue him extremely quickly, and then he uses the opportunity to tell Credence possibly the most cryptic and useless information he can. He tells him that Credence is a Dumbledore, but what Grindelwald told him was not true, which is possibly the most baffling word choices that Dumbledore could have possibly made at this moment in time. But apparently is enough to get Credence to stop attacking him, and then Dumbledore is just able to leave. We then jump over to the Erkstag, which is introduced as a German equivalent to Azkaban, so Newt goes into there using some legal paperwork supplied to him from Dumbledore, and is able to do some fancy dances to impress some creatures that might be fire crabs or something, in order to free his brother so they can shimmy the heck out of there. So overall, I actually don't have much to talk about in this Erkstag adventure, other than the actual unanswered question of what is actually in this pit. Because there's some monstrous creature in there that just seems to be killing prisoners and feeding them to the weird crustaceans that live in there. And there's been some speculation that it's a manticore, but from everything I see of this creature, there's no way that that is the correct answer, because manticores are part lion, part human, part scorpion, and aren't really associated with fire, so it really doesn't look like a manticore. And what I have to assume that this is it's some sort of version of a blast-ended scroot. And while there are distinct differences between this creature and blast-ended scroots that we learn about in Goblet of Fire, most notably the color of the creature being completely different, where blast-ended scroots are always described to be grayish or silver, and most notably that the fire that they produce comes out of their rear ends, hence the term blast-ended scroot, as opposed to their tails. As Malfoy would say it, they can sting, they can burn, they can bite, and if it walks like a duck, it's probably a visual effects artist's approximation of blast-ended scroots from the books. But anyways, as for right now, that's my best guess as to what this creature was. So Pickett the Bowtruckle and Teddy the Niffler come riding to Newt and Theseus' rescue. They deliver them the Portkey tie, which transports Newt, Theseus, and their lovable creature companions back to Hogwarts. There's also a mild kerfuffle at the International Confederation of Wizards dinner, when Lolly manages to foil an assassination attempt against one of the other candidates, and for unknown reasons, Jacob points a stick at Gellert Grindelwald in order to get him to release Queenie. This of course leads them to think that Jacob is actually an assassin trying to kill Grindelwald, and Jacob and Lolly are forced to flee, using the Portkey book again to get them back to Hogwarts as well. And also somehow Bunty finds her way back to the UK, and I'm really hoping someone picked her up and didn't just force her to get on the train and ride the train all the way back. So over in Hogwarts, a bunch of students are really fawning over Jacob's wand, which also seems like a lot of trailer fodder, because I'm having a lot of trouble understanding why these students who have been around wands their entire lives are enamored by Jacob's wand in particular, especially since it's not even real. Now, I was pretty sure that they weren't actually going to make Jacob a wizard in this movie, despite the fact that I have a whole video about how he is a wizard. I was just kind of hoping that they were going to make him a wizard in order to solve a couple plot holes from the previous movies, like why Jacob's memory wasn't wiped by the rain, or why he could use crystal balls in Crimes of Grindelwald, but I guess those are just going to kind of remain plot holes, and Jacob's going to remain a muggle. But anyways, this leads us into the third act, where Dumbledore is going to explain about the election happening in Bhutan and the entire ceremony that involves the Qilin. So the team is going to retire back to Hogshead for the night, where Dumbledore is finally going to confirm stuff that we've been speculating on for a long time. We finally have confirmation that Dumbledore's sister Ariana was an Obscurial, and we find the huge reveal of who Credence actually is. Dumbledore tells us that Credence is actually Aberforth's son. And during the same summer when Albus met Grindelwald and they started their romantic affair, Aberforth met a woman and fathered a child without his knowledge. Aberforth had a child during this time that he didn't know about, and that child was shipped off to live in America before him and his brother could find out. There's also this thing going on in the background where Aberforth and Credence are texting each other back and forth using fog on mirrors, which doesn't seem to affect the plot much, so I'm basically just going to ignore it. So the next day, the group meets at the Room of Requirement in order to commit the final part of this plan, which feels like a reference to the Thomas Crown affair, but is also possibly just a reference to Deathly Hallows when Dumbledore uses a very similar style of multiple fake Harrys in order to confuse Voldemort into not knowing which one the real one is. So Jacob, Newt, Theseus, Lolly, and Bunty all grab a case and jump through this portkey that takes them over to Bhutan so they can get to the election site. And shortly after arriving in Bhutan, Dumbledore, who originally went with Jacob, basically decides to leave him to fend for his own, because he's got his own things to do. And then, in possibly the most confusing scene of this entire movie, Dumbledore takes off his scarf and turns it into a curtain. And for the love of God, I've actually rewatched this movie since I originally saw it in theaters in order to do the most in-depth review I possibly could. And even after rewatching the scene and particularly looking for it, I still can't come up with a reason as to why Dumbledore just took off his scarf and turned it into a curtain. Like, this is some normal thing that people do. But once again, not at all related to the plot, I just thought it was really random. But maybe that was the whole point. So after Dumbledore peels off, his brother Aberforth arrives also in Bhutan, and the two of them head towards the election. Which basically confirms one of my previous Harry Potter theories, that Dumbledore knew about the Room of Requirement this entire time. So after a fancy version of 3-card Monty, we get to the site of the election, and it seems that Newt has the real case. He definitely gets closer to the actual stage than anyone else does, but is ultimately thwarted by Anton Vogel's personal attaché, who takes his case and presumably puts some spell on it, causing it to disintegrate. So Grindelwald's plan, which was to basically kill an innocent creature in the beginning of this movie, just like he did in the beginning of last movie, except this time it actually has a point, successfully brings back this creature using a form of necromancy, which I have to add was a really cool scene because we've basically never seen necromancy in the Harry Potter universe before, with the exception of the Lake of the Dead in Half-Blood Prince. But he brings back this Qilin using necromancy, and his puppeted Qilin chooses him to be the next leader of the ICW. But this is where Dumbledore's plan beautifully takes off, assuming this is what he was going for, which it really does feel like this was Dumbledore's plan the whole time, where Credence is overwhelmed by Grindelwald's lies and tells everyone that this Qilin is dead and this entire thing is a sham. This is followed up by Bunty revealing that she was the one who actually had the real case, and the Qilin then chooses that Dumbledore should be the next leader of the International Confederation of Wizards, to which Dumbledore immediately passes on the opportunity and it goes to Valencia Santos instead. Now Grindelwald gets pissed off and he attempts to curse Credence, but his spell is blocked by the combined spells of Albus and Aberforth. Which I can just imagine David Yates going bonkers when he realized that he could actually do this in a movie. Because ever since Goblet of Fire, when the wands connected in that movie, David Yates basically saw that and said, I want to put this effect in every single movie I possibly can. And it's really bothersome to me because in Goblet of Fire, there's a very specific reason to why Harry and Voldemort's wands connected. But basically since then, wands just connect is just how duels work. Which if you're not familiar with the books and you're wondering how common wand spells connecting is there, it's basically the equivalent of bullets colliding in midair. And in this movie, they have 3 spells colliding at the same point at the same time, which is the Muggle equivalent to shooting a bullet with the bullet, which feels kind of ridiculous. But whatever, it's done for pretty much cinematography. So this leads to Grindelwald and Dumbledore getting into some kind of duel, which isn't actually happening in the real world. It's kind of happening in more of like a pocket dimension, kind of like his fight with Credence. And it results in Dumbledore and Grindelwald fighting to a stalemate, and Grindelwald deciding to retreat. But the effect of Grindelwald attacking Credence and Dumbledore protecting him, in this case Albus Dumbledore, causes the blood pact to actually break, which means that Albus in the subsequent films is going to be free to take on Grindelwald without any restrictions. So Aberforth goes on to talk to his long-lost son, and when Credence asks if he ever thought about him, he responds with always, a clear reference to Snape's famous line in Deathly Hallows, which feels like it makes less sense in this context. Anyways, we get to the last scene of the movie, where we jump forward a bit and Jacob is getting married to Queenie, which was definitely heavily foreshadowed, at least since the beginning of Crimes of Grindelwald. And there we go. That's Secrets of Dumbledore. The entire movie. Grindelwald attempted to ascend to power and take over the International Confederation of Wizards, so he could use that platform in order to legitimize a all-out wizarding war against the Muggle population, but was ultimately thwarted, meaning his war effort in the subsequent movies is going to be a lot more wizard on wizard than he probably intended. And so, with that, it's time for my final thoughts. What did I actually think about this movie? And as a huge Harry Potter fan, believe me, there's no one who wants to say that I loved it more than me. I mean, I love Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, despite the fact that this was entirely a screenplay written by J.K. Rowling and didn't have the books to back it up. But for me, this movie just felt sloppy. Sloppy is the exact word I would use to describe it because it just wasn't tied up and wasn't fully there. And I know this movie had multiple issues in production because of the combination of the world climate the last few years and issues with casting, and the script had been worked on and was waiting to be completed allegedly all the way up into 2019. And I can't help but feeling there was probably even rewrites happening after that. But it just had a feeling of being unfinished and unpolished that, to be honest, the Harry Potter books never had. There is a fair plethora of plot holes and inaccuracy in this movie that I'm absolutely going to be talking about in a subsequent video, so stay tuned for that. But I'm not saying that that's why it's sloppy. I'm saying that because there's some moments of this movie that are truly beautiful and there's such a good attention to detail on them that they are really, really interesting. And for the sake of giving credit where credit is due, I'm going to explicitly talk about those things, those small details that I thought were absolutely fantastic in this movie. And unsurprisingly, it's about Dumbledore's plan. Dumbledore is always really the Machiavellian character behind pretty much everything in Harry Potter universe, and his plans are usually really beautiful once you actually find out what they were. And this movie is definitely no exception to that. Because Dumbledore's plan here is two distinct components. One, he aims to turn Credence and get Credence to betray Grindelwald, which ends up being a beautiful way for the entire International Confederation of Wizards to find out that Grindelwald is manipulating them. And it seems like a pretty good loophole towards his issue with the Blood Pact, where he actually doesn't undermine or call out Grindelwald in any way. It's actually one of Grindelwald's own supporters that calls him a liar. And he does this simply by meeting Credence for a very short time in Berlin and encouraging him to doubt what Grindelwald has been telling him, so that when he sees Grindelwald lying and manipulating people again, he's extremely encouraged to turn on him. And with the fact that Grindelwald attacks Credence immediately after reanimating the corpse of the Qilin, it's pretty much a guarantee that Credence is actually going to betray him, especially since Credence comes from an abusive past himself. And so this is a great loophole for Albus to exploit in order to subvert the Blood Pact. And then the second part of Dumbledore's plan, he uses this case shell game in order to defeat Grindelwald's ability to predict the future, which also feels a little bit inspired by the movie Minority Report, where in order to commit a crime in a world where there are precognitive people who can foresee crimes before they happen, he hires someone to do the crime who is immediately caught by someone who knows the future, and then proceeds to do the crime in the exact same way as he had told the other person to do it. And then when the seers see the crime again, it's disregarded as repeat information to a crime they had already solved. And Dumbledore does exactly this with the cases, where he uses 4 fake cases so that Grindelwald might see that Newt is going to arrive with the case and he needs to be stopped, but doesn't realize that there's actually other cases in play. But the true beauty, the Machiavellian genius of Dumbledore's case plan is in a very small detail that you need to pay attention to appreciate. And that's that when Jacob goes to pick up a case, Dumbledore tells him no, and Jacob instead picks up the one beside it. And the reason why this detail is so absolutely brilliant is because neither of these 2 cases actually contain the Qilin. In a beautiful, very subtle move that is very Albus Dumbledore as we know him, he subtly redirects Jacob to choose a different case, but by implication convinces Newt that the Qilin is actually in the case that Jacob didn't pick. So when Newt picks up a case, he picks up the case that Jacob ignored. And that's the reason why he's fully convinced that he is the one who has the real case. But this was of course a giant manipulation by Dumbledore, who knew which case everyone was going to pick. And if you actually pay attention to the details of the scene, you see that Bunty the entire time is guarding the case that is closest to her, which is the real case that contains the real Qilin. Which means that Dumbledore knew which the real case was the entire time and had actually told Bunty this plan all the way back in the train scene at the very beginning of this movie. And I mean, how can you not love very small details like that? There's also a detail about the Harry Potter universe that I absolutely love that they completely could have ignored. And that's that every time anyone does international travel in this movie, they always use port keys, which has been established all the way back in Goblet of Fire to basically being the only safe way to travel internationally using magic. Because the Flu network system is completely domestic, and apparition is more dangerous the further you try to go. And for this reason, every time someone travels a large distance or between countries using magic, they're always using a port key, which I just thought was a really good attention to detail. Now there is the question to why Lolly and Jacob, when using the book, come out of a fireplace, but I'm gonna let that one slide. But it's the true beauty of the attention to detail in those moments that for me really highlight the inaccuracies that the rest of the movie had. I mean, if the entire script was just tuned up a little bit to meet that level of thought and quality, I would have said that this is an amazing movie. But the movie did just have some stuff that either didn't make sense or was completely unnecessary. And if we're going to talk about unnecessary, we have to talk about Aberforth. Now, I love Aberforth's character. He's very relatable, very grounded, and very down to earth. But Aberforth basically doesn't do anything in this entire movie. Despite the fact that the major twist from Crimes of Grindelwald is revealed that Credence is Aberforth's son, we actually learn the absolute bare minimum about Aberforth's backstory. They literally don't give us a single other piece of information about Aberforth's backstory in this movie. They don't even tell us the name of the woman who is Credence's mother, which, fine, might be some stuff for them to explore in the sequels, but after introducing Aberforth's character, I really wish they spent any time giving us any more information about his backstory. And despite the fact that he's in quite a few scenes, his backstory is never explored or talked about. I mean, seriously, Aberforth, what is with you and the goats? This has been an unanswered question for far too long. And once Albus tells us who Credence actually is, the explanation we get doesn't actually work. See, Credence being revealed as Aurelius Dumbledore in the last movie was a massive plot hole and something that didn't really make any sense. And I, as well as many others, really did jump through hoops in order to find a way to make it work within the canon. But in this movie, they come up with a simpler, less magical explanation as to who Credence is, by combining two popular fan ideas, which is that Grindelwald lied about his identity and that he is actually Aberforth's son. Meaning that Grindelwald chose to lie about how he was related to Albus Dumbledore and not that he was related to Albus Dumbledore. Which is absolutely something that I am going to talk about again in another video. But the bigger point I'm trying to make here is the lack of attention to detail. Because in this scene it's revealed that Aberforth got someone pregnant during the same summer. Which is completely wrong! Because we know that this summer takes place in 1899. And therefore Credence would have been born in the year 1900, meaning when we first see him in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Credence is already 26 years old, which admittedly they never explicitly told us Credence's age in the first movie, but they do show us a birth certificate in Crimes of Grindelwald that has him born in 1904. And while people might complain and argue that that birth certificate we see is actually for Corvus Lestrange and not Aurelius Dumbledore, that still doesn't explain how a baby Corvus Lestrange could be mistaken for a child that was 4 years older that was Credence Barebone, aka Aurelius Dumbledore. It's just wrong! But on top of that, we have Eustace Kama, who a lot of people complained in Crimes of Grindelwald was kind of a useless character, which I vehemently disagree with, because in Crimes of Grindelwald, Yusuf played the part of being part of a red herring. He was part of the idea that Credence Barebone was actually Corvus Lestrange, and was really supporting that red herring plotline, which I admit doesn't give him the biggest role, but that is far above and beyond what he does in this movie. Because in Secrets of Dumbledore, Yusuf Kama does absolutely nothing. Like, I wish I was exaggerating, but he does nothing in this entire movie. At the very end of this movie, Yusuf is asked to betray Theseus and Lolly, to which he immediately reveals that he is not actually going to betray them and is still on Dumbledore's side. But this leads to the ultimate plot of no point. Because why did he go to Grindelwald's camp? Why was he in all these scenes? And really, if he wasn't there, I'm sure Theseus, who's the head of the Auror office, and Lolly, who's extremely talented at defense against the dark arts, could have handled this on their own. It really follows the principle of Chekhov's gun in narrative storytelling, where if something is going to be introduced to the narrative, it is imperative that it serves a purpose. And you can get every single scene that's focused around Yusuf and remove all of them from this movie, and the movie would still make the same amount of sense. Fans would have the exact same questions, and nothing in the plot would change. So I mean, what a useless character. What a waste of screen time. And finally there's the Erkstag, the German prison which Theseus is being held in, which, as for the plot of the movie, also doesn't really serve a purpose. Theseus gets locked up, Newt goes to save him, end of the side plot. And a part of me can't help feeling that this scene was actually put here so that they can actually introduce some creatures into this movie. Because without this scene, Fantastic Beasts actually have a shockingly few number of beasts in it. Which, to be honest, is a weird thing that J.K. Rowling has handicapped herself with by making the series about Fantastic Beasts, despite the fact that the next couple movies and most of the series is really focused on Grindelwald. But I'm not just saying this to be a wet blanket. I'm not just saying this to be the fun police and saying, no, you can't have blast-handed Scroots in this movie, we need to focus on plot. I'm saying this because there are things in this movie that needed to be explained and talked about that just weren't. Firstly, a thing that kept bothering me in this movie is how do these characters keep getting into places? I mean, not only do they enter the Ministry of Magic in Germany, but they go to this very upscale dinner for the International Confederation of Wizards. And I can't help but think that this must be an invite-only event. And there's no point in the dialogue whatsoever that explains that they're invited to this or how they are allowed to be there. This happens again at the election, where we're basically not told who is at the election, who is allowed to be there, or who's allowed to vote. Now, we can make assumptions that the only people who are allowed to vote are members of the International Confederation of Wizards, but this needed to be explicitly told to us because it's never explained. And with the fact that people are routinely stunned and spells are routinely going off in these crowds at these major events, it seems silly that there's a distinction that there are people actively monitoring who is putting up the votes that get Grindelwald or any of the candidates elected. There's also the missing pieces of information to how Dumbledore knows everything. I mean, Dumbledore always seems to know everything in the books, but there's a multitude of reasons to why he does. He's an accomplished legilimens, he has spies everywhere, and his knowledge of magic is second to none, which is why he seems to be omniscient. But Dumbledore's immediate knowledge that Theseus is being held at the Erkstag and the ability for him to help Newt get him out seems to come out of nowhere. Now, this is possibly because the scene was cut out around then, where Dumbledore actually writes to the German Ministry of Magic. But if that's true, they are cutting out pieces of information that we need. But those small problems are secondary, completely insignificant compared to the much bigger problems of the script and the story in general. Because a much bigger problem, a plot hole that I actually need to talk about in this video, and not the upcoming plot holes, inaccuracies, unanswered questions video, is Credence. I'm talking about all of Credence's arc in this movie. Considering how vital of a character Credence is for this movie, the amount of time dedicated to his arc is really badly done. When Dumbledore has the chance to talk to Credence in this movie, he tells Credence the most useless information he possibly could. He tells him that Grindelwald lied to him, but he is still a Dumbledore. And then he immediately leaves, which means Credence must have gone around in the background finding out exactly what Grindelwald's lie was, and somehow in the background finding out that Aberforth was his father. And maybe he also pieced together that Aberforth didn't know he was born, or didn't know that he survived the boat incident, and that's why he could forgive the Dumbledores. And maybe this actually happened. But if this did happen, this is something we needed to see in the movie. Instead, it's glossed over, leading us to believe that the reason why Credence betrayed Grindelwald in the end is because Grindelwald lied about how the Dumbledores betrayed him, and not that the Dumbledores betrayed him. Feels a bit silly, right? I mean, it might just be me, but I feel like the idea of your father abandoning you is even worse than the idea of your brothers abandoning you. And yet, somehow, this isn't the biggest problem. At least not for me. Because for me, the biggest problem is the Blood Pact. See, the Blood Pact was arguably better explained when it hadn't been explained at all. Because based off what we knew about it at the end of Crimes of Grindelwald, we basically assumed it was something like an unbreakable vow, where if you try to break it, it will kill you. And all it did was ensure that Dumbledore could not actively act against Grindelwald. He could not fight him in person, and that explained why he kept sending proxies to do the war on his behalf. But in this movie, Dumbledore does the extra step to confirm that not only is the Blood Troth ensuring that he doesn't fight Grindelwald in person, but he also can't even plan against him, which is a very confusing inclusion because everything Dumbledore is doing is in a way undermining Grindelwald. And it really seems that the secret to Dumbledore's success here is undermining it in such a complicated way that the Blood Pact itself can't figure out that he's actually betraying him. And the Blood Pact itself also seems to have access to this interesting pocket dimension where him and Grindelwald can talk to each other and in fact have this little mini duel at the end of the movie that is completely unexplained. Though it is kind of tied into a theory I've made before, and I'm pretty sure an extension of that theory can fully confirm exactly what's happening in those scenes, which I'm probably going to post later. But at the end of this movie, an item that Dumbledore says that can't be undone is broken, and for reasons that are pretty random. According to Dumbledore, it breaks because he didn't act against Grindelwald. Instead, Grindelwald tried to attack, and he tried to defend. Which is a hyper simple explanation to something that is very complicated and seems completely random. And I guess as a person who writes film theories, I shouldn't be complaining because this leaves something very open and unanswered for me to explain. But considering how vital the Blood Pact is to this movie and the entire Fantastic Beasts series, you figure it could have gotten a more specific explanation. And that's it. I think this movie did have pieces of brilliance inside of it and does contribute to the overall Fantastic Beasts narrative, kind of pushing it to the next stage. But I think at the end of the day, production issues did get in the way and overall contributed to this movie coming across a little bit less polished and refined than the quality that we had come to expect in the books. And I think a little bit more refinement, a little bit more editing on the script would have gone a long way to really making this a top tier movie. But even with those things aside, I still kind of consider this movie to be a step up from what we had in Crimes of Grindelwald. And I think it sufficiently does what it needed to do in setting up the next stage when we're finally going to see the Wizarding War erupt in its full glory, and we're going to have all-out magical conflict between Grindelwald's forces and Dumbledore's. So anyways, guys, that's just what I'm thinking. Stay tuned for my upcoming video where I talk about the stuff that I omitted here, all the plot holes and inaccuracies and unanswered questions I found in the movie, as well as upcoming theories that I'm going to have explaining the ending of this movie. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. I did spend a lot of time trying to do the best review I possibly could for you guys. Let me know what your thoughts about the movie are. Did you guys figure out why Dumbledore made a curtain? I still haven't. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see all of you in my next video. Bye.